Dr. Julianne Pollard Larkin as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Pollard Larkin received her bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics from the University of Miami in 2002. She earned her master's degree and a PhD degree in biomedical physics from UCLA in 2007 and 2008, respectively. After completing her medical physics residence at MD Anderson in 2010, she stayed on to become a faculty member there. Currently, Dr. Pollard Larkin is a ABR certified medical physicist and associate professor in the Department of Radiation Physics, Patient Care, and the Division of Radiation Oncology at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Pollard Larkin is very active in the medical physics community and currently is the chairwoman of AAPM Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee. She is a member of many committees in the AAPM and other professional societies. Besides providing medical physics clinical service to patients, Dr. Pollard Larkin is also conducting clinical research, mentors medical physics residents, and teaches graduate students. Her primary research interests include pacemaker radiotherapy dose measurements, improving the efficacy of motion management in thoracic treatment and radiobiology. And I think probably another thing is more recently, she has done lots of work on flash radiotherapy. 2 years ago, I attended her talk on flash RT at the 2019 AAPM annual meeting in Texas. Like many others there that day, I was deeply impressed by her inspirational presentation skill. I'm confident that you will agree with me on this after listening to her talk today.
Right.
Beyond being a traditional medical physicist, Dr. Pollard Larkin is a firm believer in outreach and improving the pipeline of women and underrepresented populations in science. She is a big advocate of promoting more people in the above group to follow in her steps and enter into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. She is going to give us a talk remotely on how can we lead the way for equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, in STEM. Let's give her a warm welcome to Dr. Pollard Larkin.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And please say your last name.
My name is Sumi Zhou.
Zhou, Dr. Zhou, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And I want to help make your AAA dream for the future come true by figuring out who these new medical physicists could be if we choose to lead the way for equity, diversity, and inclusion within STEM. Next slide, please. So my name, you already have heard Dr. Zhou say it many times, Dr. Julianne Pollard Larkin. Go ahead, next slide. Let's just get straight to the chase. A lot of times when people discuss EDI or equity, diversity, and inclusion, they're concerned about what they can do. They feel like it's an intractable issue, something they can't solve. There are things you can do right now as an individual. Right now, as you're sitting there holding your cup of coffee in front of your screen, educate yourself on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and reflect. Take that moment. Be humble, willing to learn from another viewpoint, and willing to be honest about when you get it wrong. Just like me asking how to pronounce someone's name. It's that simple, and it's that easy to do. Get implicit bias training and take the Harvard Implicit Association test so that you can identify what your own personal biases are, and then you can start to adjust your activities based upon them. Volunteer for the equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts within your own department and institution or society within AAPM. Expose yourself and everyone else to the wonderful underrepresented racial minority talent within your field, and as well as the other women physicists that populate our field as well. And then remember, most importantly, that's why it's underlined and italicized, equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI, is not a destination. It's actually a new way of behaving, of treating people more respectfully and being a better human. Next slide. So let's get some education on EDI. Next slide. What does diversity mean? We throw this term around and a lot of times people misuse it. Diversity is about a collective or a group and can only exist in relationship to others, meaning you cannot say that a candidate is diverse or we need more diverse candidates. A candidate is a unique individual subunit. Next slide. Look at these pictures here that try to depict what diversity and inclusion are and help you to understand the differences between them. They are not two terms that mean the same thing. Diversity is simply a fact. It just explains all the unique differences that make us special and separate as individuals when we're in a group setting. Inclusion, wholly different. Inclusion refers to you actually having some type of autonomy and ability to have an impact in the outcome of whatever your group does. That means that you are actually valued, that people listen to your input, that not only are you invited to the dinner, you have a seat on the table and you help pick what's on the menu. Next slide. Equity, the E in EDI, that is not the same as equality. And I feel a lot of us, especially as lay people outside of the social sciences, we find it very difficult to understand, well, aren't we just asking to be treated exactly the same and get everything the same? Not so much. Equality and equity are two very different things. Equality is simply sameness. It's giving everyone the same thing, irrespective of their personal statuses. Equity, that refers to justice or fairness, meaning that I take into account that, yes, you come from a very different background than me, and you might have some limitations or some boundaries that prevent you from having the same access to opportunities as myself. And then I make adjustment for that. And that way, you then can enjoy the same thing in the same way, but given what you need in order to access that opportunity. Next slide, please. Why do you care? As an amazing center, and I want you to say thank you so much to all the people who gave me the opportunity to speak today. The reason why everyone on this call right now, this Zoom call, should care is because you represent a wonderful healthcare institution, whether you're in the Midwest or not. You want diversity. Why? Because as a scientist, you care, and especially as a clinician as well, you care about increasing innovation, creativity for better problem solving, especially complex problem solving. As you already heard, we have a wonderful AAA plan for the future, which will include lots of automated techniques. And we're going to need to be able to work together with many different talented people in a cohesive manner to move forward. Then if you actually care about what they're saying, meaning you provide inclusion, then you're going to get enhanced engagement with your team cohort, increased productivity, improved job satisfaction, enhanced morale, talent optimization, increased trustworthiness, and then finally, community responsiveness, which correlates with your patient output being better, meaning that their actual outcomes for all the treatments that you're providing, you'll see an improvement and the way for them to actually pay attention and to follow through with any of the course of actions that you ask them to as a clinician. Finally, when you provide equity to this cohort, what you'll realize is that everyone in your team will finally have what they need to actually live up to their full potential within the realm that you have given them. And that will make your healthcare system or your program excellent. Next slide. How does this correlate with patient outcomes? You may be wondering, I don't get it. How can equity and taking into account someone's different background help improve health outcomes? This particular graph shows you that. It helps to explain how well African-American patients listen to advice from their healthcare team when their provider either matches their cultural background or does not. So on this chart, what you'll notice is that the non-Black doctor actually happens to be represented by this dark gray bar. And then the Black doctor happens to be represented by the blue bar. What you'll notice is that for each of the different activities where the doctors are trying to impart healthcare advice to the Black patients, whether it's about blood pressure techniques they can utilize, diabetes, cholesterol, body mass index, when they are given that advice by an African-American doctor who represents their African-American background, they listen more and take that advice. This matters. When you have an actual pool of people working in your department that represents the same cultural background as your patients, you will have improved health outcomes because they feel connected to one another and they're better able to effectively communicate with that team. Next slide. So what's going on in physics right now? I'm talking about pure physics. Next slide, please. When you look at the disparities amongst who's getting PhDs in pure physics across the field, and you look at it based upon gender, there's a huge and stark disparity where women are only getting 20% of the PhDs that are awarded in physics. Next slide. This is not because women are not capable of doing the physics that they are actually pursuing when they're trying to get these PhDs. This chart here shows you that men and women, when they take those very difficult advanced placement exams in the physics subspecialty, what you realize is that there's not a huge disparity in how well we're passing those exams. Women can do the work. And when you look at the high school numbers of how many girls are taking the high-level physics classes, it is the same as their male cohort. I want you to understand, there is no disparity as we go all the way through high school. It starts to show at college where women start to not go into the coursework for physics as much, but they're still capable of passing the exam. And then once you get to graduate study, it's a whole new world. Next slide, please. When you look at the racial disparities amongst physics PhD awardees, this slide makes me want to cry every single time I see it. Along both of the y-axes, you notice that that is not a percentage. Those are whole numbers indicating how many individuals from either Hispanic American background or an African American background literally received a PhD in these respective years. In 2016-17, that means that for Hispanic Americans, only about 38 individuals from the entire United States of America, all 50 states, only 38 got those PhDs. Then for African Americans, even sadder, only about 14 in that time period received PhDs for the entire nation. Next slide. What does this then result in? And many of you could actually attest to this. How many of you actually had a Black physics PhD holding professor in undergrad? Please raise your hand now. How many? The reason why, this chart explains it. Only 27, when you try to look for the departments within the entire United States that have been part of this study, which is 746 total, only 27 departments have both an African-American faculty member of any degree holding and or a Hispanic American faculty member as well. So when you try to have the beautiful duality of having both a Latino and an African-American professor in one physics department, only 27 out of 746 in the US have them. That's how sad it is. Next slide. When you look at the gender differences, how many of you had wonderful female physics professors? The number should be a little bit higher. You know why? Because over the number of years, finally, as of 2018, we've just eked out 45% of most of our physics departments actually having 5 or more women faculty. When I was coming up in my particular institution, and Dr. Joe actually said which school I graduated from, the beautiful University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida, I had to do the U, we only had one physics professor that was a woman. So I want you to understand these disparities impact who actually is still teaching physics, and then that corresponds to the cycle of less and fewer students realizing that they too could perhaps be a teacher or a physics professor because they don't see someone living that reality in their particular schools. Next slide. But please remember, all it takes is one teacher of color to inspire a classroom of students who come from underrepresented backgrounds. In fact, just as a Black student having one Black teacher increases their interest in pursuing college, and it decreases their chance of dropping out of high school. Next slide. But I want you to understand, please don't think, oh, all I have to do is hire one. That's not the quota that I want you to leave or walk away with, because quotas do not work. We need to consider critical mass. And critical mass is something that we utilize in physics to explain the minimum amount of material to keep a reaction going. Imagine if you now applied that to EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. If you do that, you'll realize that EDI critical mass will refer to a minimum number of any underrepresented group of individuals in order for them to succeed and thrive in an environment, meaning having the mentorship, having the advocacy, having the access to people who will help them move forward and feel like they belong. That is what you're looking for. And that number is not one. Next slide, please. So let's talk about critical mass and get very personal for myself. I'm going to put my own department and institution on blast. So let's look at the faculty ethnicity demographics for MD Anderson Cancer Center here in Houston. What you'll notice is that on the upper row shown on top, you'll realize that it shows you the breakdown of how many faculty of each different category, whether it be white, shown in blue, Asian, shown in orange, Hispanic, shown in green, Black, shown in yellow, or others shown in gray on that top bar for the 1,719 total faculty members here at MD Anderson Cancer Center. I've highlighted and circled in red the 4% of faculty who present as African American within MD Anderson as a whole. Now let's jump down a couple of rows to the radiation oncology department, shown there with that beautiful blue star looking like the Dallas Cowboy symbol, but I'm not trying to rep for them right now. Right over the 12% column for African American faculty within radiation oncology department. I want you to hone in on that. In our Rana clinical department for our MD faculty, 12% actually identify as African American. But now let's go to the radiation physics department row right beneath that, and you see squared off is that 3% for that yellow bar. What is that yellow bar? That's me. 3% of 37 happens to be one individual. I happen to be a one faculty member within my physics department who corresponds to being African American, but still I thrive because I'm connected to and I work alongside a department every day that has 12% of their faculty being African American. Next slide. What does that look like in real life? This, 8 Black full-time RO faculty at MD Anderson Cancer Center. So although I may be the only Black physicist, every time I look around and I get an order, I get a requirement to do something in the clinic, I get to bump alongside, get advice from, get invited to parties from individuals who represent my own cultural background, which gives me the critical mass that I need to succeed and become a service chief. Next slide. Why is this so amazing? This 8 RADONC faculty full-time members at MD Anderson Cancer Center in one department. Because when you look at the entire United States of America, notice those red arrows where they're pointing to. Out of all practicing physicians in radiation oncology, only 3.2% happen to be Black. And then when you say how many are full-time faculty who happen to be Black and RO, only 27. That's the whole number, and it's only 1.5% if you look at percentages. But there are only 27 Black full-time RADONCs in the entire United States of America. And MD Anderson has 8. That's why Julie is great. That's why Julie is happy. That's why Julie is stoked this morning at the break of dawn without even a drop of coffee. This is what I'm telling you about. Now, and you have stats like that that completely outdo what's going on a national average. You can provide the support system and the structure that your faculty need to succeed. Next slide. When we talk about these numbers, a lot of times people think it's just nice enough to let the minorities through the door or the women through the door and just give you a job. No, at my particular institution, not only are a faculty of color allowed the opportunity to thrive in their departments and do wonderful clinical work and research, we also are given the opportunities to rise up in the leadership structure. Not only is one of my Black RO faculty a wonderful clinician, she also just got named recently the Chief Medical Executive of the entire institution. Wonderful, Dr. Walela Tarefa. Next slide. So let's get to the STEM pipeline, because I know a lot of you are wondering, well, how in the world did they get 8? Good God, if there's only 27, I'm glad you asked. Let's really look at the bigger, broader issue for all of America and take race out of it. So if we don't talk about race, Let's just talk about the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics pipeline and figure out where do we get our students from, whether they're going to physics or medicine or whatever. Let's start by looking at, believe it or not, the ninth graders. We start off this chart looking at 2001. In 2001, we had 4.01 ninth graders entering into high school in America. Yay! They all had hopes and dreams of succeeding and getting their high school diploma and perhaps going into college. Lo and behold, at 2005, when they should have all graduated, only 2.8 million actually graduated from high school in America. This has nothing to do with color, all to just do with just whole numbers who graduated across the entire US. So if you graduated from high school on time, which I hope everyone on this call did, especially if you were raised in America, clap yourself on the back. You passed a big hurdle in America. Next part of the pipeline, how many wanted to go to college? 1.9 million of those kids wanted to go to college. So there's a sad fact that 0.9 million either didn't think they could or at least had another career option. So 0.9 million said, nah, I don't have any desires to go to college. Then that means fall 2005, 1.3 actually got admitted, accepted, and are in some type of college program. And then 278,000 out of that 1.3 million, I decided that, you know what? Science looks right for me. And then after that, lo and behold, out of that 278,000, only 167,000 happen to be STEM graduates from college. That is what the huge system of US education looks like as you try to progress and get your STEM degree. So when we talk about this whole pipeline issue, let's not try to hit the minorities on the head and say that they are the ones with the problem. There's not enough. We don't get it. There's something wrong with them. There's something wrong with US education, even before you even look at STEM. We aren't graduating all of our high schoolers. So we need to stop, forget about even the major, and just realize, why aren't our kids even passing the basics just to be a good citizen? Let's start there. Then we can start getting angry and pointing fingers at who's doing more STEM or what. Next slide. So if we decide to go and look deeper at the STEM graduates and only focus on race, this is what the STEM pipeline looks like when you focus on this racial differences. So in the A column shown on the left-hand side, you'll notice that it's going to correspond with how do white students progress towards STEM PhDs. In the B column shown on the right-hand side, that corresponds to people who are of color, whether it be Latino background or African-American background on the B column. So if we start from the very bottom, what you'll realize is that we start off with the intent to get STEM degrees at the same rate, whether or not you're white, Black, or Hispanic. 37.6% of non-underrepresented freshmen declare, I want a STEM degree. And 34.8% of Black and Latino students say, I want a STEM degree too. That's great. We're almost walking in parity. Next column, as you move up, how many of the actual STEM degrees are awarded in undergrad? Believe it or not, it doesn't matter what race you are. 32.2% of the white students are getting their STEM undergrad degree, and 31.6% of the Latinos and Black students are getting their STEM undergrad degrees. Hello, go America. That's the American dream. I wish we could just stop right there and just clap and walk away. No, because you know what you want next. You want to go for that doctoral degree. And so this doesn't look at master's, this looks only at the PhD. This is where you see the baffle or barrier circled in that red rectangle. When you see this, you'll realize in the A column, for the white students, 51% of the doctorates awarded in STEM go to them, and then 38.1% go to the underrepresented students. Somehow we start to see a dichotomy in the trajectories of our students based on race when they enter the pressure cooker known as graduate school. And I'll have a slide to explain what some of the different pressures are. Finally, when you get to the academic workforce, meaning being in academia, being a professor like some of ourselves on this call right now, or working in industry with a PhD in STEM, the damage is completely and irrevocably done, where you'll start to notice that 90% of all of such members of that faculty or in industry happen to be white versus 10% being underracially represented. Next slide, please. What are some of these barriers in the pipeline, especially as you get into graduate school? It comes down to the one color that matters a lot in America, alongside being Black, white, or brown, or in between. Green, money. Believe it or not, A lot of the students of color, nearly 75% and 79% of the Black and Latino students, noted that their work responsibilities, in order to have enough money just to be able to live and get by, are interfering with their educational performance. These kids are under financial duress due to the background that they're coming from, which tends to be less than a median family income. This is the major stressor on their lives. Followed by that, their family not fully supporting their academic endeavors because they see them putting themselves in school almost like a jail sentence and not making enough money to get by. That's why a lot of students of color have very little emotional support coming from their families to work it out within academia, because they don't understand fully what a professor's life looks like and how that will be very responsible financially for their entire family as a whole. Because a lot of these students of color come from very tight-knit social groups that they try to support their entire extended families and so forth. So understanding these differences helps us understand why these students want to work and make enough money, even at the expense of their academic careers. Next slide. So what can we do? Well, physics has come up with an answer through the American Institute of Physics, through their Team Up report. Next slide. The suggestions that they come up with are even good for our own institutions as well as AAPM as a whole. In order to help to increase the number of underrepresented racial minorities graduating with physics PhDs, we need to foster a sense of belonging for these students. We need to provide them with a sense of physics identity and diversify the faculty and mentors available to them. We need to provide effective academic support to them, provide financial support, have leaders and administrators who not only speak about EDI, champion it, and actually bring up leaders who represent it. Hello, like our wonderful Dr. Tarefa, and then change our own EDI climate at our institution so that everybody can thrive alongside one another. Next slide. So medical physics, guess what? We have one good success story. And I want to tell that because I love talking about the good things with regards to equity, diversity, and inclusion. If you've noticed, and I know you probably have, Dr. Joe and everyone else, whether you're in the Midwest or not, you should have realized when you look at the graduate students or even your residents, you had some beautiful red-haired women. I think I saw that in your picture in your class. That's amazing. You know why? Because out of physics as a whole, this is unusual for us to have 42% and sometimes larger percentages of our student cohort, whether they be at the master's level or at the PhD level, being female. Next slide. So that means we have 42% of our med phys PhD students were women in 2017, which is over double what you see in pure physics as a whole. Next slide. But this does not exist when you look at the full membership level of AAPM, meaning that when you get beyond trainee status, when you're trying to look at how many professional working physicists in medicine happen to be women, that's roughly 23 to 25% where we are right now in AAPM. And that corresponds to a reduced number of women leaders in AAPM at multiple different levels, whether you're looking at how many have been president, whether you've been physics editor-in-chief for medical physics, and so forth. So we have so much more room to grow. Next slide. Never forget that although the number of physics president, AAPM physics presidents that have been women have been low, we still have 5 that have progressed through. And the future is bright and ripe for the taking for the next woman president of AAPM to be inducted. Next slide. When we look at the racial statistics within AAPM, this is a puzzling problem and a very difficult problem to deal with because only 4,025 members in AAPM willfully and voluntarily report what their race background is, compared to the 9,435 of us that could and should. So when we look at these numbers, you must take that into account. We don't have a full assessment of what everyone is because not everyone is willing to report. Therefore, when we look at the 4,025, we can see that there are notable differences between the number of African Americans that are self-reporting in AAPM versus the US Census. So we have 2.9% that are reporting in AAPM versus a 13% of the US population that have to be Black in our United States of America. What you'll notice then, we see these disparities, but it would be nicer to have a fuller picture, hopefully in the future, of over 7,000 or so forth of our members fully reporting, so we can get to the truth of this. Next slide. When it comes to equity, diversity, inclusion, climate, that term that I've used before, really matters. That means, how well do you feel included? When we have a conversation, do you feel comfortable speaking up in an AAPM meeting? Do you think that there's a welcoming climate when you go to a meeting in AAPM? Do you feel welcome in informal discussions? Do you feel like everything fosters respect within AAPM? Do you feel like they acknowledge your contributions? Do you feel comfortable sharing your personal information? Do you feel any intimidation or hostility or microaggressions? When we ask these questions in our first EDI climate survey in AAPM that you all should have gotten access to this year, note that there were differences amongst men and women respondents. Women experience more of these biases than men. Next slide. And not shockingly, when we started to look at racial differences, of course, there are some subgroups, such as the African American Latino cohort, that we didn't have a large enough sample size because of the lack of members of those particular backgrounds to say something conclusively. But for our Asian and Asian American cohort who self-identified as such, we did notice racial differences and whether or not they felt they had the same opportunities to volunteer, to be on committees and involved with committees, as well as for leadership positions with AAPM when compared to our white respondents. So there is work to be done even for racial differences within AAPM. We finally have the data to support that. And of course, for all the other subcategories of marginalized groups, we need to do focus groups as well to understand what's going on there as well. Next slide. Why is this happening? And many of you may be thinking that, oh, America is in a post-racial state. You've already had one Black president. You're good. You're done. There's a funny big elephant in the room. Segregation and our desires as communities of color and even communities of not color to segregate into our own respective groups is strong in America even today. And I know you may be shocked. Clutch your tie right now. Clutch your tie or handkerchief. Segregation, especially in schools, is highly thriving right now. And in fact, has gotten worse as we have matured as a nation. So back in 1991, this particular chart shows you how many Black students happen to go to white schools, meaning being brought in to integrate, meaning actually having the same access to wonderful, highly funded schools and giving them a better chance of succeeding and moving on to college and so forth. The numbers have dropped steadily over the years from 1991 to 2018. So the funny thing is that I was in 5th grade when this chart started with that data collection at 1991. And now as I look at this last couple of bars, I realize the area that the age that my own children would be probably living in, where only about 14 to 25% are going to be likely to be able to be in a school that is a white majority school, because we are starting to see that fewer African American students are going to schools where they have the same type of access to the majority. What they're going to end up in is staying in minority majority schools where they are less funded, less likely to have access to the technology that they need in order to be wonderful, competitive students for STEM. So these numbers are startling and troubling. But when you start to pay attention to where people are sending their kids, even amongst your compadres that you work alongside, and even yourself, if you think about it quietly, you'll start to understand a lot of people make the choice to keep moving away from communities of color for education, and in fact, taking away tax dollars from it too, and putting their kids further and further away from other communities of color, which causes almost like a brain drain effect. But really more importantly, it's a tax drain effect, and it causes bad schools to get worse over time, and startlingly worse. Next slide. I want you to understand that this whole idea of this post-racial America, as we try to adjust and bring in students of color to our departments, and even when we're excited, we have a great new candidate and so forth, this is going to be awesome, let's bring them into our space that isn't used to them, please realize that can cause issues with your majority setting. Why? Because when you introduce new Black students to communities that they are not typically seen in, sometimes people just call the cops. Even if you have a graduate student in physics, you still end up sometimes being marginalized and treated as other when you have not been given a wonderful environment to succeed and thrive. If you're going to have wonderful recruitment activities, make sure you tell your security. Yes, tell your campus security, look for these students. It's good to introduce them to them as well so that you don't have these embarrassing interactions. And also create and establish a no harassment policy that goes beyond just your gender, your race, or other different kinds of background that corresponds to diversity to protect all involved. Next slide. So what does this require from me? It requires me to move from mentorship to allyship, meaning don't just try to get someone on a task group, start to be an active ally. Educate yourself on what equity, diversity, inclusion is about. Interrupt behavior that you find non-conforming to a good professional medical physics department. Interrupt and educate, as well as initiate organized response in your particular community and setting. Next slide. So we need to have a philosophy change. We need to move from just tolerating people who have different backgrounds to celebrating those differences. Next slide. And that means moving from the idea of a number or a quota is enough. We cannot suggest that. We need to pay attention to climate. How well does everyone feel? Does everyone feel like they belong? Does everyone feel included? Are we all having a say in how we move forward? Or are there people that are being ignored? Next slide. So I'm on the ad hoc committee on diversity and inclusion. I lead that, and it's a wonderful group that was brought together in order to identify and enumerate the diversity needs of AAPM at both the organizational level as well as to recommend strategies in order to meet these needs. Next slide. We came up with some final recommendations, which include the following: to establish an EDI committee underneath the professional council, establish EDI training for all of us within APM and medical physics as a whole, provide and analyze those climate surveys for EDI that I mentioned before, enact the Rooney Rule, which I'll describe in the next slide, establish funding and award opportunities for minorities in EDI work, and then create and maintain a national mentorship network of underrepresented medical physicists, because there's so few of us that we need to have some mechanism to be able to talk with one another. Next slide. So the Rooney Rule. How many of you guys watch football? All right. If you watch football, then you're probably somehow familiar with the number that skyrocketed of Black NFL head coaches. This was not always the case. This man Rooney, shown in the right-hand panel, he decided in 2002, after they realized a very low number of any African Americans ever being given the designation as a head coach of the NFL, that something needs to change. So he came out with the simplest measure to help do that. He said, in effect, that by 2003, guess what, gentlemen? We need to at least interview one woman and one racial minority candidate for any of these positions that we're trying to actually fill. That doesn't mean you have to choose the woman or the minority. It means that you at least have to give them a fair chance at the interview session. After that very simple rule, letting a woman and one minority through the door at a minimum, guess what? And you see it there, the stark and sharp increase of the number of applicants who became actual NFL head coaches who happen to be of color. Thank God for Rooney. Next slide. So those are simple measures that you can utilize in order to move us forward. So as a MedPhys organization or a department, if you want to start championing EDI, develop your own EDI committee. You don't have to just wait for AAPM's EDI committee to do the work. You need to figure out what's going on within your space, your community right now. Perform your own EDI climate surveys for everyone, not just for the minorities in your department. Review your hiring and admission practices and exit surveys. Find out why people don't want to stay and find out what's keeping them. Provide EDI training for your entire group. Get everyone treating everyone with respect. Leave no one behind in this. And then provide funding for EDI work. Next slide. Tips for marginalized physicists. If you happen to be a woman or somebody who feels marginalized based upon your race or other type of identity status, LGBTQ or LGBTQ or plus or anything like that, you must first assess that your work climate is right for you. I'm speaking straight to the people who are affected most by this. You must practice mindfulness to determine if you are okay. Identify allies and advocates and use them liberally, whether they're within the Midwest chapter or if they're beyond and outside of that area. Grow in your skills and profession. Be an excellent medical physicist. Help someone else on your path by acting as their ally or advocate, and repeat. Next slide. Please remember, everyone on this call, whether you're marginalized or not, and I want you to, true tokens don't exist. There is no such thing as a true token, because a lot of times people are concerned with this idea of a quota and bringing in that just one physicist of some background in order to fix everything. And they are only brought because of their skin color or their gender. No one is hired simply because of a quota. I want you to understand, nobody's going to look outside the hospital window of University of Nebraska and say, wow, I saw a Black person, let's put them in our physics department and get them in here so that we can solve our EDI quota problem. Nobody ever does that. You know why? Because they don't want their department to fail. They find people who can meet the requirements for the position, and then they decide, do they also fit the goals of making sure that we have enough women and racially underrepresented groups as well? You are never hired simply because of something that you could not control or something about your identity. Nobody is willing to throw their whole system away on that. So if you ever feel that way, if you ever hear someone say you're brought in just because you're Black or just because you're LGBTQ, that is never the case. Nobody's willing to do that. So understand your excellence and walk with your head held high. And then for all of us, please remember, anyone and all of us are susceptible to imposter syndrome. So just do it scared. You should have a sense of humility every single day that you don't know it all. You should not ever walk in thinking you are the smartest person at your center. If you do, you need to get to a bigger center. So understand imposter syndrome hurts everyone, but it is not a reason for you to hold back and not be excellent. Next slide. One of the most beautiful ways to end this is a comment that was stated during a recent board of directors meeting for the AAPM. It was said by our president-elect, Esam Salmon, and it's about equity. He said, recognizing that the table is not ours to give access to, it's more important for us to remember that it belongs to all of us. This table called equity, it actually is not ours to give other people access to. It's not about us allowing underrepresented racial minorities or women to the table. That table is all of ours already. What our point to do is to actually back up and give space for them to thrive, eat, sit back, and smile just like these wonderful people in this picture here. This could and should be us. This wonderful depiction of a group just enjoying and communicating and no one overseeing the other, everyone just thriving, living, laughing, excelling, and performing at their intended way. Next slide. So I want to say thank you guys so much for your attention and your time and for all the leaders who helped put this together. You can find me on Twitter at JulieLarkin305, and also you can email me at jmpollard@mdanderson.org. Thank you guys so much, and I am done.